Security to room 156, security to room 156. The radio crackled as David finished his rounds, but this wasn't a typical call. Behind that door was a dying boy who had one last wish: to see snow before he left this world. It was July, 95 degrees outside, and medically impossible to move him. But David had learned that impossible was just another word for no one has tried hard enough yet. 7 years ago, his own son had died with an unfulfilled wish. Tonight, that would not happen again. Welcome to Stories Worth Telling. Before we begin this powerful story of sacrifice, hope, and unexpected miracles, please let us know in the comments which city you're watching us from today. And if you believe stories like these deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button and help us ensure they're never forgotten. David Rodriguez adjusted his security badge as he walked down the familiar corridors of St. Catherine's Children's Hospital. At 42, he had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much sorrow, but his eyes still held the gentleness that children seemed to recognize instinctively. His black uniform was always pressed, his boots always polished, and his radio always answered on the first call. But tonight was different. Tonight, the call wasn't about a broken window or a suspicious person in the parking lot. It was about a miracle that seemed impossible to deliver. David pushed open the door to room 156 and found Nurse Patricia standing beside the bed of 9-year-old Marcus Williams. The boy was small for his age, his head bald from chemotherapy, his skin pale against the white hospital sheets. But his eyes were alive with hope that broke David's heart. "What's the situation?" David asked quietly, though he could already see the answer in Patricia's expression. "Marcus has been asking about snow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's from Arizona, never seen it in person. The doctors, they don't think he'll make it to winter." David looked at the boy, who was pretending to sleep but listening to every word. Outside, the July heat shimmered off the asphalt, making the air conditioning work overtime. The nearest snow was hundreds of miles away in the mountains, and Marcus was too weak to be moved even to the next room, let alone to another state. "Has anyone explained to him?" David started. "His parents tried," Patricia said. "But he keeps saying he's not ready to go until he feels snowflakes on his face. He's been drawing pictures of snow angels all week." David's chest tightened. 7 years ago, his own son, Alex, had lain in a bed just 3 floors up, asking for one last thing before the cancer took him away. Alex had wanted to see the ocean, to build one sandcastle before he died. David had promised they would go to the beach as soon as Alex got better. But Alex never got better, and David never kept that promise. "Marcus," David said softly, approaching the bed. "I'm David, the security guard. I heard you've been asking about snow." The boy opened his eyes, studying David's face with the serious expression that sick children develop too young. "Nurse Patricia says it doesn't snow in summer." "She's right about that," David said, sitting in the chair beside the bed. "But you know what? I've seen a lot of impossible things happen in this hospital." "Really?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. "Really? Would you like me to see what I can do?" Marcus nodded, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. David spent the rest of his shift planning. He called in favors from hospital maintenance workers, researched industrial cooling systems, and even contacted a friend who worked at the local ice rink. But every option led to the same conclusion. There was no safe way to bring snow to a dying child in the middle of summer. At 6 a.m., as his shift ended, David drove home to his empty apartment. The same apartment he had shared with Alex and his ex-wife Sarah before the cancer tore their family apart. Sarah had blamed him for not getting Alex to the hospital sooner, for not recognizing the symptoms, for not being able to save their son. She had left 6 months after the funeral, unable to look at David without seeing their failure. David sat at his kitchen table and stared at the framed photo of Alex, 8 years old, gap-toothed grin, holding a bucket and shovel at the beach they never visited. Below the photo was a small box containing Alex's last drawing, a picture of him and his daddy building a sandcastle under a bright yellow sun. "I'm sorry, buddy," David whispered to the photo, as he did every morning. Daddy couldn't keep his promise. But as he looked at Alex's drawing, an idea began to form. It was crazy, probably impossible, and definitely against hospital regulations, but David had learned that sometimes the most important rules were the ones that needed to be broken. He picked up his phone and started making calls. "Miguel, it's David. I know it's early, but I need a favor, a big one." Miguel Santos had been the hospital's head of maintenance for 15 years. He owed David for covering his shifts when his own daughter had been in the ICU. More importantly, he understood what it meant to fight for a child's life. "What do you need, hermano?" Miguel asked. "I need you to help me build winter in room 156. There was a long pause. "David, it's July. It's 95 degrees outside." "I know. That's why I need you." 2 hours later, Miguel arrived at David's apartment with a truck full of equipment: industrial fans, portable air conditioning units, sheets of reflective material, and enough ice to stock a restaurant. David had spent the morning driving to every party supply store in the city, buying white fabric, cotton batting, and anything that could look like snow. "You know this is crazy, right?" Miguel said as they loaded everything into David's truck. "The best things usually are," David replied. They spent the day planning their operation. The transformation would have to happen during the night shift, when fewer people were around to ask questions. They would have one chance to get it right, because Marcus's condition was deteriorating rapidly. That evening, David arrived for his shift with nervous energy coursing through his veins. He completed his regular rounds, checking doors, monitoring cameras, and filing his hourly reports. But his mind was focused on room 156, where a little boy was waiting for a miracle. At 11 p.m., when the hospital settled into its quiet night rhythm, David met Miguel in the basement. They loaded carts with their equipment and began the careful journey to the pediatric wing. "Room 156 needs to be empty," David said into his radio. "Maintenance issue?" Nurse Patricia, who was in on the plan, moved Marcus to a room down the hall for what she called routine tests. The boy was confused but cooperated, trusting the adults who had been caring for him. For the next 4 hours, David and Miguel worked like men possessed. They covered the windows with reflective material and set up a perimeter of air conditioning units to drop the room temperature to near freezing. They draped white fabric from the ceiling and scattered cotton batting across every surface. The portable fans were positioned to create gentle air currents that would make the snow dance. But the centerpiece of their winter wonderland was David's masterstroke, a humidifier filled with crushed ice, positioned to create actual snowflakes that would fall gently from the ceiling. It wasn't real snow from the sky, but it was frozen water crystallizing in the air, close enough to fulfill a dying boy's wish. At 4 a.m., they were finished. Room 156 had been transformed into a winter scene that would have made Disney jealous. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees, white fabric created the illusion of snow-covered hills, and genuine snowflakes drifted down from the ceiling like nature's own blessing. David stood in the doorway and felt tears freeze on his cheeks. It was beautiful, peaceful, and magical in a way that made him believe in miracles again. "Think it'll work?" Miguel asked, his breath visible in the cold air. "It has to," David said. They returned Marcus to his transformed room just as the sun was beginning to rise. The boy was drowsy from medication, but when he saw the winter wonderland that had replaced his sterile hospital room, his eyes went wide with wonder. "Is this real?" he whispered, watching snowflakes land on his blanket. "As real as I could make it," David said, adjusting the boy's cap and pulling extra blankets around him. Marcus held out his hand and caught a snowflake on his palm. For a moment, he just stared at it in amazement before it melted against his warm skin. "It's cold," he said with delight, "and it tickles." For the next hour, David sat with Marcus as the boy experienced snow for the first and last time. They talked about snowmen and snow angels, about winter and Christmas, about all the things that Marcus had only seen in pictures and movies. "Mr. David," Marcus said, as the artificial snow continued to fall around them, "do you think my mommy and daddy will like the snow too?" "I think they'll love it," David said. "Should we call them?" Marcus's parents arrived an hour later, tears streaming down their faces as they entered the magical winter room their son had wished for. They spent the morning building tiny snowmen on Marcus's bedside table and making snow angels in the cotton batting that covered the floor. Marcus's father, Robert, pulled David aside while Marcus was showing his mother how to catch snowflakes. "How did you do this?" Robert asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I had help," David said. "A lot of help." "But why? You don't even know us." David looked at Marcus, who was giggling as snowflakes landed on his nose, and then at the photo of Alex that he carried in his wallet. "Because every child deserves to have their wishes come true," David said, "especially the ones that seem impossible." That afternoon, Marcus fell asleep surrounded by artificial snow and the love of his parents. The room temperature had returned to normal, but the magic lingered in the air like a promise kept. Marcus passed away peacefully 3 days later, but not before telling every nurse, doctor, and visitor about the night it snowed in July, about the security guard who had brought winter to his room, and about how sometimes miracles came disguised as ordinary people who refused to accept that impossible was truly impossible. David attended Marcus's funeral on a hot Saturday morning. The service was held outdoors, and as the pastor spoke about children finding their way to heaven, a gentle breeze carried cotton seeds through the air like snow in summer. Marcus's parents found David after the service.
"We wanted to give you this," Robert said, handing David a small wooden box. "Marcus made it for you before he couldn't anymore." Inside the box was a hand-carved snow angel and a note written in a child's shaky handwriting. "For Mr. David, who brought me snow. Love, Marcus. P.S. I saw Alex in my dream. He says thank you for keeping your promise." David's knees nearly buckled. He had never told Marcus about Alex, had never mentioned his son's name, but somehow, in the way that children understand things adults cannot, Marcus had known. That night, David sat in room 156, which had been returned to its normal state. The equipment was gone, the artificial snow cleared away, but the memory of that magical night remained. His radio crackled. "Security to room 203, security to room 203. David sighed, stood up, and answered the call. Room 203 housed a little girl named Emma who had been asking about butterflies. It was winter now, and butterflies didn't exist in December. But David had learned something important. Impossible was just a word people used before someone proved them wrong. 6 months later, the hospital administration noticed something remarkable in their patient satisfaction surveys. Terminally ill children in the pediatric wing were reporting significantly higher happiness scores and fewer requests for sedation during their final days. Families were writing letters praising the guardian angel who seemed to make their children's last wishes come true. Dr. Elizabeth Manning, the chief pediatric oncologist, decided to investigate. She began paying closer attention to the night shift activities and soon discovered an elaborate network of hospital employees who were quietly fulfilling dying children's final wishes. She found maintenance workers who had built elaborate cardboard rocket ships for children who wanted to be astronauts, kitchen staff who had prepared Thanksgiving dinners in July for children who wouldn't live to see November, janitors who had transformed sterile rooms into jungle adventures, underwater kingdoms, and fairy tale castles. At the center of it all was David Rodriguez, the night security guard, who had somehow convinced dozens of hospital employees to help him create miracles. Dr. Manning confronted David during his shift one night. "You're breaking protocols," she said, but her tone wasn't angry. "Unauthorized room modifications, unsupervised patient interactions, violation of safety standards. "I know," David said. "Are you going to fire me?" Dr. Manning looked around the break room where they were meeting. On the walls were photos and letters from families whose children had been helped by David's network. Thank you cards from parents whose children had died happy. Drawings from kids who had lived long enough to go home.
"No," she said finally. "I'm going to help you." The next month, St. Catherine's Children's Hospital announced the creation of the Final Wishes program, officially sanctioning what David had been doing unofficially for years. David was promoted to Patient Advocate Coordinator, a position created specifically for him. The program gained national attention. Other hospitals began implementing similar initiatives. Television programs featured David's story, but he always deflected the praise, insisting that he was just one person in a network of people who believed that love was more powerful than regulations. 1 year after Marcus's snow day, David received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a snow angel and a letter from Marcus's mother. David. Yesterday was the anniversary of Marcus's death, and we visited his grave. When we arrived, we found this snow angel that someone had built on his headstone. It was 80 degrees outside, and there was no snow anywhere else in the cemetery. We don't know how it got there, but Marcus would have loved it. We think he still has friends watching over him. Thank you for teaching our son that miracles are real, and for teaching us that love doesn't end when life does. P.S. We've established a foundation in Marcus's name to help other terminally ill children fulfill their final wishes. We hope you'll be our first board member. David wiped tears from his eyes as he finished reading the letter. That evening, he drove to the cemetery and found Marcus's grave. The snow angel was still there, somehow maintaining its shape despite the summer heat. He knelt beside the small headstone and placed Alex's drawing of the sandcastle next to the snow angel. "I kept my promise, buddy," he whispered. "Both of them." As David stood to leave, a gentle breeze stirred the air, and for just a moment, he could swear he saw 2 boys playing together in the distance, one building sandcastles, the other making snow angels, both laughing with the pure joy that only children possess. The night security guard walked back to his car, his heart full for the first time in 7 years. Tomorrow night, he would return to the hospital where another child would be waiting for a miracle. And David would be ready, because he had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest healing happens not when we save a life, but when we honor the life that cannot be saved. In the pediatric wing of St. Catherine's Children's Hospital, miracles happened every night. Not the kind that cured diseases or reversed death, but the kind that reminded everyone involved that love was stronger than loss, that hope was more powerful than despair, and that sometimes the most important job in the world was helping a child's final dream come true.